Welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about Food of the Gods, The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge by Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna was a pretty fascinating man, kind of a mystic, ethnobotanist, cultural critic, I guess you could say, but I mainly know him through his advocacy for psychedelics. There was sort of a psychedelic movement cohort in the mid-late 20th century, and he was one of its most central figures. Over the years, I've read a little bit of his writings, I've listened to some videos and recordings of him speaking, and basically his main thing is like exploring the intersection of human consciousness, altered states through psychedelics, and the natural world. He wasn't really a scientist or a guru in the conventional sense of either word, but he is a little bit like a synthesis of those two practices. He spent a lot of time thinking and speculating and writing about the origins and future of human consciousness. This book, Food of the Gods, I think encapsulates his whole approach quite well. It's this blend of anthropology and mythology and pharmacology and speculative theory that proposes this idea that the evolution of human consciousness, and more broadly human culture in general, was directly shaped by our relationship with psychedelic or psychoactive plants, especially psilocybin mushrooms, and that reconnecting with these ancient bonds is essential to healing both our minds and the planet. He kind of attempts to reframe human history and like what it means to be conscious through this lens. Some of his ideas in this book are pretty far out there and probably not very sound by modern scientific standards, but some of his ideas are brilliant and prescient and give you the sense that one way or another, he was definitely onto something. Either way, it's a pretty fascinating book, and I guess I'll just be spending this review talking about what I feel are his main ideas and what I thought about them. I briefly mentioned this already, but I would say the most fundamental point this book is trying to make is that psychedelics shaped human evolution and human consciousness. This is Terence McKenna's famous stoned ape theory, which again proposes that our ancestors' interactions with psychedelic plants, especially psilocybin mushrooms, played a direct role in the rapid development of human consciousness, language, symbolic thought, social cohesion. He's arguing that these compounds were literally catalysts in human evolution. Their influence fostered adaptive traits like sharper vision, cooperation, complex communication, which are all defining characteristics of Homo sapiens. He is arguing this through the framework of legitimate natural selection, like the use of psychedelics conferred evolutionary advantages, and those advantages made certain individuals more fit for survival and reproduction and were thus passed down. This is essentially pure speculation. I don't think there's any empirical evidence that supports this idea, but it is somewhat compelling given our neurological affinity for tryptamines like DMT and psilocybin. The fact that they're so chemically similar to neurotransmitters in our brains like serotonin, which is also why our brain is able to so efficiently and harmlessly metabolize them, at the very least may imply an evolutionary relationship. Even though this is ostensibly the main point of the book, it's also the idea of his that I found to be the least convincing personally. He even admits himself that there aren't really any good candidates for a psychedelic whose use was widespread or consistent enough to drive species level selection. Also, as somebody who's spent a lot of time studying linguistics, he has a number of very unorthodox takes regarding language and language evolution that are very outlandish. He's very big into this idea that language is a kind of magical force that shapes or even produces reality, and that psychedelics were directly responsible for the very inception of language itself. I think a lot of times when he's talking about language, he is speaking metaphorically or symbolically, but I also think that looking at linguistics scientifically, like as an empirical field of study, it does demystify it to a degree, and I think some of McKenna's ideas about it are a bit silly. The other main points this book makes are largely anthropological, and I think these areas are where McKenna's arguments are at their strongest. The first one I want to bring up is this idea of partnership versus dominator cultures, which is something that comes up constantly throughout this whole book. Essentially, Terence McKenna is arguing that before agriculture and organized religion and patriarchy, human culture were rooted in partnership rather than domination. He brings up a multitude of examples of societies throughout ancient history who used psychedelics in shamanic rituals to heal and to facilitate community and to connect with nature and God and with each other. These cultures apparently had very deeply ecological worldviews. They were very much centered around communal values, and there was a strong reverence for altered states of consciousness as a legitimate form of spiritual knowledge. And there's a lot of evidence for this. Evidence can be found in the ritual use of substances like ayahuasca in the Amazon, iboga in West Africa, the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece. Also, there's archaeological sites like Cataloyuk in modern-day Turkey and Minoan Crete, which are full of psychedelic imagery and like goddess figurines and literal depictions of mushrooms. From here, McKenna goes on to detail the ways in which humanity fell from grace, so to speak, the ways that we turned away from our symbiotic relationship with nature and instead embraced hierarchy and control and domination instead. The way he untangles this is by arguing that with the shift from nomadic foraging cultures to settled agricultural ones, society had an increased need for hierarchy, labor control, land ownership, things of that nature. And as a result, our relationship with psychoactive plants was slowly repressed in favor of other plants that were more suited to these new and worse values. There are entire chapters in this book devoted to alcohol, sugar, caffeine, and tobacco, and the ways that these modern drugs, and he emphasizes that these are in fact just as much drugs as psychedelics are, how they specifically reinforce productivity and obedience as opposed to introspection, empathy, connection, and the types of things that are reinforced by psychedelic plants. He strongly insinuates that these substitutions were not accidental but were deliberate decisions integral to the rise of industrial society, colonialism, and consumer capitalism in which we currently live. He claims that these substances actively uphold systems of war and industry and therefore modern alienation. These are obviously all pretty bold claims, but he does back a lot of this up with real examples from history of governments or other powerful institutions pushing these other substances for this exact purpose. You have the British Empire's promotion of tea and opium leading to the Opium Wars in China, the widespread adoption of coffee in European work culture during the rise of industrial capitalism, and the US government's tacit endorsement of alcohol and tobacco while hypocritically criminalizing psychedelics. McKenna keeps pointing out that these substances tend to reinforce conformity and productivity and dependence, which are traits that are more aligned with hierarchical control, whereas psychedelics, by contrast, provoke introspection, creativity, and a challenge to the dominant social paradigms, which is the exact reason that they are suppressed. He's very vocally critical of the war on drugs throughout this book, how it's not based on any rational public health concerns like they say, but is instead based on fear that certain substances have the potential to disrupt the status quo and capitalist productivity. He even compares the ongoing criminalization of psychedelics to the moral panic of hearsay or witchcraft in the Middle Ages. Based on what I've described so far, the book sounds pretty pessimistic, but Terence McKenna intentionally frames everything this way in order to offer his version of a solution, that despite all of this repression, there is still hope, even though humanity is facing extinction through environmental degradation and overconsumption and just general disconnection from reason. This book was written in the 90s, by the way. Psychedelics remain powerful and necessary tools for healing and insight and inspiration and potential reconnection with the natural world. He explicitly calls for decriminalization of these substances, education about them, and the development of modern shamanic practices to help people safely access these states and maybe even reimagine civilization itself for the better. Overall, I think this book has a lot going for it. Certain aspects can be a bit of a stretch from a scientific perspective. McKenna loves to make logical leaps. He's a bit dogmatic, and he sometimes has shaky underlying assumptions about things, but I'm willing to forgive a lot of that because I'm not sure there's anyone else ever who is so articulate and whose ideas I trust more when it comes to the topic of psychedelics and what they do and what those experiences might mean. To this day, it's still somewhat of a taboo subject, which I think is a shame because so much of what he says is so obviously true and insightful and significant. I said earlier that I enjoy watching or listening to McKenna's lectures. I think he's at his best when he's just riffing about the universe and God and nature in a more unstructured format, but I can appreciate this sort of thing as well. He's attempting to relay some of his many fascinating ideas and understandings in a more methodical, structured context, and I think that's important too. The stakes of all this, as he argues, are existential. We must choose between extinction and transformation. It's definitely an interesting read if you're into this sort of thing. I'd probably give it a solid 7.5.